Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming. And I want to talk a little bit about the Haftorah and then swing over and connect it to the Parsha. Again, these are the Haftorah. These are the Parshios of Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Ramban calls the whole book of Shemos Sefer HaGeula, the book of redemption. And of course, it's interesting. The English word, or from the Greek, is Exodus, which is only one facet. Exodus refers to leaving Egypt. But in fact, the Ramban points out that Shemos is not only about leaving Egypt. Shemos is about Matan Torah, and it's about the Mishkan, in which the Shekhinah comes into the world. Leaving Egypt is only the first step in what is redemption. So the truth of the matter is, Sefer Geula is not synonymous with Exodus. Exodus is focusing on only one part of the story, where you get out of. But where you get out of isn't necessarily where you're supposed to be going. And the book of Shemos is concerned not only with where you leave, but to where you're going towards. In fact, even in our own holiday observance, that's why we link Pesach and Shavuos as one long holiday through the counting of the Omer, as if to say freedom has a value only when it's connected to submission to God and living for a higher purpose. This was beautifully stated by the Indian poet Tagore, who won a Nobel Prize for Literature. Again, I don't know if he even knew a Jewish person, but he once made an observation. He used a metaphor. He said that a human soul is like a violin string. In a violin string is a tremendous capacity for beautiful music. But if the string is totally loose, take a loose string and put it on the table, you will not be able to get any music. Paradoxically, counterintuitively on some level, it is only when it's tied down and restricted that the music within emerges. And he said a human soul is very much the same way. People think, if only I would be free, then I would be able to achieve everything I'm able to achieve. But freedom without responsibility is like a loose violin string. There is no music within. It is the idea of submission to God that gives a person freedom and liberation. And this is the meaning of what Chazal say in Pirkei Avos, Ein ben chorin el mi she'osek b'Torah. True freedom is only when one learns the Torah and lives by the Torah, because then you have a structure within which the music of the soul can emerge. That is why it's particularly true in affluent societies like the United States or the like, that the suicide rate, particularly for teenagers, is relatively high. It's much higher than in poor countries, because in a poor country where you have to spend the whole day looking for a piece of bread, you don't have time to worry about existential angst and life crisis. But precisely in a society where your material wants are basically satisfied, at least on a basic level, obviously people are not rich, so at that point you get hit with the idea, okay, I have enough to eat and I have a roof over my head. But what's the purpose of my life? What am I living for? And human beings in general, and Jews in particular, are hardwired to seek meaning and purpose in their life. And when that meaning and purpose is not there, that creates a tremendous turmoil. Some people try to crush that pain by workaholism or drug addiction or sexual addiction, whatever it is. But there is that pain that just doesn't go away. And in a very extreme case, it can turn into murder, suicide, everything else. The violence turned inward and then turned outward. And that is why in the Torah, we never celebrate freedom unless it is coupled with responsibility and purpose. Pesach and Shavuos are joined by the counting of the Omer. Chazal make the point that the korban of Pesach, the sacrifice, was a barley sacrifice, and barley was commonly fed to animals in the time of the Torah. On Shavuos, we bring a wheat sacrifice, which is what is fit for human consumption. And the concept is freedom without Torah is simply animal liberation. And only when it's connected to Torah does it become human dignity. And that is why it's a very fundamental mistake when people say the purpose of life is freedom. Freedom cannot be a purpose. Freedom does not define anything. Freedom is the absence of restriction, but then the question becomes freedom to be what and freedom to do what. So freedom, we could say, is a condition for flourishing and a condition for the ability to achieve meaning, but freedom alone cannot be a meaning. Freedom does not give you any meaning in life, and that is why it has to be linked to something greater than yourself. And that is why Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Ramban says, or the book of Shmos, is not only about Exodus, it is about Matan Torah, with the ultimate goal of bringing God into the world, which of course is the idea of the Mishkan. Now, a few words about the Haftorah. Obviously, Parshas Va'era is the story of the majority of the 10 plagues. 7 of the 10 are in this Parsha, and essentially we basically see that God is the true master of the universe. He can change the laws of nature, and he could even take away the free will of a human being who would otherwise let the Jews go, because Paro would have been broken eventually. But God wanted to play with him the way you play with a toy, because there was a larger point here, that Hashem is the master of all. And therefore, this Parsha is aptly connected to the eventual downfall of Mitzrayim. Now, if we flash forward to the book of Yechezkel, once again, we are dealing with the prophet Yechezkel, and Yechezkel was a prophet whose prophecy spanned the years between the first wave of exiles and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. You'll recall that when Babylonia conquered the land of Israel, they first exiled the aristocracy and the learned element to Bavel, but they allowed a small remnant to remain in Eretz Yisrael under the reign of Tzidkiyahu. 11 years after that first exile, Tzidkiyahu rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and that resulted in the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the galut of the rest of Am Yisrael. So Yechezkel is the Navi for the 11 years. There's already been a significant wave of exiles. The Beis HaMikdash has not yet been destroyed. Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu are literally contemporaries. They are living at exactly the same time. The difference is Yechezkel was a Navi in Bavel, together with the Talmidei Chachamim that went to Bavel. Yirmiyahu is in Eretz Yisrael, and Yirmiyahu experiences the Chorban. In that sense, Yechezkel is a quite unique book, because he is the only one of our Nevi'im whose Nevuot are in Chutz La'aretz, whose Nevuot are in Bavel. And indeed, we also know that his Nevuot are extremely elevated and sanctified. He has visions of the Kisei HaKavod, the throne of glory, the divine chariots. Yechezkel was one of the Nevi'im that had the greatest, clearest perception of certain aspects of divinity that other prophets did not have. And the fact that it wasn't Chutz La'aretz, Chazal identified as an anomaly, as something that was very strange. But part of it was God comforting the Jewish people, that even when they're in Galut, the Shekhinah will be with them. So Yechezkel is talking in Bavel, Yirmiyahu is talking in Eretz Yisrael, and both of them are giving Musar and Tochacha to Am Yisrael, that if they just do tshuva, the tremendous tragedies that are all set to come, they can still be averted. There is still time. Don't give up hope. Now the problem is, of course, it's not that the Jewish people gave up hope, it's the other way around. They were complacent, they were arrogant. Although Nebuchadnezzar had already conquered Eretz Yisrael and had already exiled a significant number of Jews, particularly the Talmidei Chachamim, but the Jews who remained thought that they were protected. They had what you might call, Piaget called, magical thinking, the magical thinking of a child. And that is, they said, Hashem loves us. We have the temple. We have the Beis HaMikdash. Surely the nations of the world are not going to defeat us, because God is on our side. But you know, the ultimate message of the Nevi'im is a message very similar to Abraham Lincoln, that at one of the cabinet meetings during the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s. So one of the cabinet members, in those days, you know, God was more freely invoked than maybe today. One of the cabinet members remarked, you know, Mr. President, we shall surely win against the Confederacy because God is on our side. And Lincoln said, it's much more important to us that we be on the side of God than God be on our side. People sometimes think that religion means I got God, you know, God works for me, you know, God listens to me, God gives me what I want. It doesn't always work that way. Even the greatest tzaddikim, there is suffering in the world, the whole mystery of theodicy Tzadik v'ralo, that the righteous suffer, Rasha v'tovlo, the Rasha prospers. This is a really fundamental, difficult issue. So the issue is not, I get God to do what I want. The issue is, do I do what God wants? In fact, they say with the Chafetz Chaim, very similar thing, that when the Chafetz Chaim died, so they asked his son, Chazal say, Tzaddik goes there, the righteous person decrees. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Makayim, and Hashem listens to what the Tzaddik decrees. Can you give us an example of your father doing that your father gave a bracha and it was fulfilled? Whether it's a shidduch or parnasa or children or refuah v'chola. Give us a good story of Tzaddik goes there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Makayim. So the Chafetz Chaim's son said, I'm sure that there are probably many, many stories like that. But I can just tell you, my father was much more concerned with HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes there, but Tzaddik Makayim. God decrees and the Tzaddik fulfills, instead of the Tzaddik decrees and the Ribono Shel Olam fulfills. So this is what the Nevi'im are talking about. The Nevi'im are not really giving a message of hope, because they're not speaking to a hopeless people. It's the other way around. They're speaking to an overconfident people that are filled with arrogance and gaiva and a misguided sense. See, this is where the idea of being the chosen people turns out to be destructive. A sense of being the chosen people in the sense that God will give you a free pass no matter what you do. And the message of the Nevi'im is, number one, recognize that there's so many things that you have to correct, avodah zarah and interpersonal relationships and Shabbos and kashrus, all of these things. But at the same time, they do couple it with a message of hope by basically saying, if you do turn to Hashem, even now, He will forgive you, He will redeem you, He will take care of you in every way that you do, that you need, but it's not going to be automatic. Now, it is automatic in the sense that Hashem will never destroy or allow the Jewish people to be totally destroyed. That much is basically almost an automatic idea. But the notion that we will be spared the ravages of Chorban and Galut, that's just not true unless we do tshuva. Right? So that's what the book of Yechezkel is about. That's what Yirmiyahu is about. But there's a second part of the book of Yechezkel in which Yechezkel gives a number of nevuot, not about what will befall the Jewish people, but what will befall the various nations that have persecuted the Jewish people. Now, this is a whole section of nevuot that are concerning the other nations of the world in that region. Now, Yechezkel has a section about them, Yirmiyahu has a section, and Yeshayahu has a section. In other words, one of the characteristics of Nevuah is we have Nevuot not only about Am Yisrael, but we have Nevuot about the Umot HaOlam. Now, there is a fundamental ambiguity exactly. How do you understand Nevuot to the Umot HaOlam? Are these messages that the Navi was commanded to communicate to the Umot HaOlam? Was he sent? Now we know one prophet was specifically sent to the Yiboneh Archives, but we only know one prophet explicitly, and that of course was the prophet Yonah. Yonah, the Navi, was sent to the city of Nineveh to bring them to tshuva. However, when it comes to all of these different prophecies, there is no indication in the text that the Navi was told to communicate this to the nations of the world. And as far as we know, he never did. So the question becomes, what is the utility of prophecies concerning Assyria, Babylonia, Egypt, if these are not going to be communicated to Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt? And the short answer is, it is part of the comfort that the Navi is giving to Am Yisrael. That part of the comfort is, yes, these nations will afflict you, these nations will kill you, these nations will destroy the Beis HaMikdash. But you should know that ultimately there is divine justice in the world. And nobody ever gets away with anything. And ultimately, these nations that have afflicted you will eventually have their downfall. So essentially, the prophecies of destruction vis-a-vis the Umot HaOlam are considered to be part of the nechamot, part of the comforts for Am Yisrael. They are not necessarily intended to be communicated to the Umot HaOlam. Now, it is very interesting that Yechezkel has a number of nations that he talks about. Ammon and Moab and Mitzrayim. But it's fascinating that the one nation whose downfall he does not discuss, and the Mefarshim have a lot of problem with this, is the most obvious nation that he should have discussed, and that is Bavel. There is no nevuah in the book of Yecheskel regarding the downfall of Bavel. Even in Tehillim, we have, with Ruach HaKodesh, we have a psalm that talks about the downfall of Bavel. That's the famous by the rivers of Babylon, Al Naras Bavel, which, how do you actually understand that? Either David wrote it with Ruach HaKodesh, or it was a later psalm that was inserted. Either one is theologically acceptable, because we do accept that there were Tehillim that could have been added later. So it says Bavel, would be destroyed. But in the book of Yecheskel, there is no nevuah regarding the Mapala of Bavel. It's very, very interesting. So the Mefarshim give a pragmatic answer, that since Yecheskel was living in Bavel and was under the control of Bavel, it was not, would have been sakanat nefashot, it would have been pikuach nefesh, to start talking about the downfall of Bavel. So Yirmiyahu, who's living in Eretz Yisrael, at least at a certain distance, was able to talk about it. Yecheskel is in the lion's den, mixing my metaphor with Daniel, but Yecheskel is in the lion's den, and therefore God did not give him the responsibility of a nevuah regarding Bavel. But the Haftorah of Va'era, therefore, is one of Yecheskel's nevuos regarding the downfall of a nation, and quite logically, the chapter that is picked is the downfall of Mitzrayim. The connection to the Parsha is very, very apparent, even though they're separated by 1,000 years. That is, Parshas Va'era, the downfall of the Mitzrayim that enslaved the Jewish people, and this is later the downfall of the Egyptian Empire at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, who will conquer Mitzrayim. And the basic theme here is that the sin of Mitzrayim, now it does not refer to them enslaving the Jewish people, because that's an old sin. We're talking about the sins at the time of Yecheskel. But the sin that existed at the time of Yecheskel was a sin that existed all the way back, and that was the sin of arrogance, of hubris. One has to remember the central role of the Nile in Egyptian culture. The Nile was seen really as a god, and it was a miraculous process. Egypt got virtually no rain at all, and yet every year the Nile would swell, and then through the overflowing of the Nile, different tributaries and different irrigation ditches would be filled. And every single year, it seemed like almost a miracle. It's a well understood process, but from their perspective, it seemed like a miraculous process that this life-giving force of water would come every year. And Egypt was a very fertile land. As a result, the Nile Delta covered thousands and thousands of square miles. And Paro himself, at various times in history, including in the time of the Torah, but in the time of Yecheskel as well, proclaimed himself the god of the Nile. And God says, because you have proclaimed the Nile as your god, and you are the master of the Nile, so the analogy is, I will take a fish hook and drag you out of the water the way you drag a big, big fish. And there'll be a lot of little fishes that'll be stuck to you like barnacles. And I will drag you out and throw you in the desert. And you will be left as prey for the beasts of the desert and the birds of the sky. Again, the metaphor is, it's like taking a big, gigantic fish, throwing it in the middle of the desert with a lot of little animals attached to it, and totally vulnerable, totally helpless, losing its power. This is the graphic description, metaphorically, of the fact that Nebuchadnezzar he didn't, in fact, this, by the way, is after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Nebuchadnezzar shall break the Egyptian Empire, and then there's an interesting reference, and for 40 years, the land of Egypt shall be barren and empty. For 40 years, and then you will return. It's interesting. God makes a promise, almost kind of a kibbutz goliath from Mitzrayim, but it's a very limited promise. And after the 40 years, you will come back and establish your malchut. but it will be a malchut shefala. It will be a lowly malchut, no longer having an empire. Okay, so there actually is kind of almost a quasi-messianic promise that you will be brought back after the 40 years, but you will no longer be significant as a world actor. Now, don't confuse this. At a later point, Egypt became important, but not because of the Mitzrayim. It became important because of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which were the Greeks from Alexander, right? So Egypt's later importance was not connected to the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians were essentially kaput after Nebuchadnezzar, although they did maintain an insignificant local presence. Now, Rashi gives a very interesting medrash, just a fascinating medrash, this concept of the land of Egypt would be desolate for 40 years. What's the connection of the 40 years? So one medrash says, well, the Egyptians indirectly caused us to wander in the desert for 40 years, although they didn't really cause it. Our own sins caused it, but because of Yetziat Mitzrayim, we wandered away from our land for 40 years, so they have to go through what we suffered because of them. That's one idea of 40 years. But then Rashi brings another medrash, which is very, very fascinating, that all the way back from the time of Paro and the time of Yosef, when God, remember that Yosef had dreams and there were 7 years of famine, by rights, there should have been 42 years of famine decreed on Mitzrayim. Where do you get 42? Because the Torah recounts Paro's 2 dreams. Paro had 2 dreams. One of the sheaves of grain swallowing up the sheaves of grain, and the other, the thin cows, swallowing the fat cows. Right? 7, 7. So there are 2 dreams. One dream involving 7 sheaves of grain, and the other involving 7 thin cows. So that's 14 altogether. Paro had the dream. Paro told Yosef about the dream. And then Yosef repeated the dream in explaining it to Paro. So it turns out that the 2 dreams are mentioned 3 times in the Torah. Right? The 2 dreams are mentioned 3 times in the Torah. Paro dreaming it, Paro telling Yosef, and Yosef telling Paro. Now, each time it was repeated, there were 6. There were 14 mentioned because there were 7 thin cows, 7 sheaves of grain. So the 14 times 3 is actually 42. So there should have been 42 years of famine in Mitzrayim. Now, how many years were there actually? So Rashi says there was only 2, because what happened was that when Yaakov Avinu came to Mitzrayim, it was the famine already, and Yosef told Yaakov there's another 5 years of famine, but Chazal say, in the merit of Yaakov, Hashem took away the famine. So it turns out of the potential 42 years, Mitzrayim only experienced 2 years. So there's still 40 years that's hanging on them. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu therefore uses the 40 years of abandonment, of galut from Mitzrayim, as a way of being mashlim the 40 years of famine. That's how Rashi understands this situation. But as I say, the overall message of the Haftorah is not simply the downfall of Mitzrayim. That would just be a historical fact that is no longer relevant. But the concept that arrogance and hubris are hated by God, because the attitude of Paro is, I am the master of the universe. I control the creation of life and death. I am the master of the Nile. And that type of attitude, HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately hates. The Gemara tells us that when there is gaiva, when there is arrogance, the Shekhinah cannot dwell in this world. So we have to look at ourselves in the same way. You know, human beings in this day and age are capable of accomplishing tremendous things. We've conquered many, many diseases. We've drained the swamps. We can control a lot of aspects of the weather, control the creation of life in different ways with fertility technologies. We've discovered the secret to unlocking the awesome potential of the atom, which on one hand could solve the energy crisis of the world, and at the other hand could also destroy the world. That's another way of solving the energy crisis of the world. So in a sense, our skill, our knowledge, our ability, our understanding of science and technology is really unparalleled. Now, it may be true that in terms of moral and philosophical development, we're not necessarily that much better than even the ancient world, although no one could argue there's been progress in some aspects of morality from a secular perspective. But still, the great, great nisayon of our time is that of arrogance and hubris and thinking that we are the masters of our fate. Because when one does not recognize that everything is biyad HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then chas v'shalom things happen which remind the person that they are not in control of things. Certainly in Eretz Yisrael, this is what we learn almost every day. Again, I don't want to be an amateur political theorist here, but many people have speculated, or they say, often they say it, I don't want to say anything with certainty, that if you compare the aftermath of the Six-Day War in 67 with the Milchama of Yom Kippur, 73, which was largely a very, very, right, Six-Day War, the aftermath of the Six-Day War was one of euphoria, one of joy, one of amazement. And then the aftermath of Yom Kippur, which Baruch Hashem we survived, but still there was a great, great depression, a great malaise, a great sense that, we just didn't do it. Some have pointed out that the aftermath of the Six-Day War had two different reactions. There was a reaction among many of tshuva, of gratitude to Hashem. In fact, the whole Baal Tshuva movement, many say, is connected to the Six-Day War, in which there were people who saw what they regarded as nisim gluyim, open miracles, and the like. But there was also a different reaction in which we are the best army in the world, which Baruch Hashem we are. Okay, I'll acknowledge that too. But the concept is we can beat anybody, we can defeat anybody, we can win over anybody, simply because we're the smartest, we're the best prepared, we're the strongest, we're the most skillful. And although, Baruch Hashem, a lot of those positive features happen to be true, but when the attitude is divorced from gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then what often happens is Hashem shows us, okay, you want to do it alone? Let's see how well you do it without me helping you to the same degree. And then you get Yom Kippur and you get various other things. So many see that Yom Kippur itself was regarded as kind of the antidote to the arrogance and hubris that some felt in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. And that's really the message of the Haftorah, that when one has the attitude, I am the boss, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my ship, there can unfortunately be very, very devastating consequences. And particularly at a time and an age where we are so far advanced in so many different ways, we have to remember this idea of humility, modesty, and recognizing our limits. Okay, so that's kind of the general message of the Haftorah, and its connection, again, is taken from the Rabbi Yecheskel, part 2. Part 1 of Yecheskel, Perek Aleph to Chav Daled, are the Nevuos about the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Part 2 of Yecheskel, from Perek Chav Hey to Brown Mem, is Nevuot against the Umot HaOlam. And the last part of Yecheskel, which is very, very interesting, but it's not for this week, is he actually gives us the detailed diagrams in words of the third Beis HaMikdash and how Yerushalayim will look. So he is what you call a bricks and mortar Navi, meaning unlike Yeshayahu, whose messianic visions are abstract and universal. He talks about peace and goodness, etc. Yecheskel talks about buildings. He talks about it'll be this and this and this. In other words, he had a very, very graphic, pictorial image of what Eretz Yisrael will look like. So our whole knowledge of what the third Beis HaMikdash will be is based on Yecheskel. Now, obviously, it is extremely difficult to describe buildings without pictures. And since HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for whatever reason, did not include illustrations in Kisvei HaKodesh, so that's why the Meforshim have many, many different views about how would you draw a third Beis HaMikdash based on the verbal descriptions. But nevertheless, different Meforshim have done so, whether it's the Malbim and the Violin, other Meforshim as well. The Art Scroll, incorporates obviously things from different Meforshim. Okay. Now, what I wanted to swing back and connect to the Parsha a little bit is this, that the Parsha begins with, at the end of last week's Parsha really is one of very profound disappointment on the part of Moshe Rabbeinu. At the burning bush, Moshe Rabbeinu begged Hashem over and over and over again, really very excessively, saying, please don't give me this job. I don't want it. I'm not good at it. And he was using every possible argument. I don't speak well. They don't deserve it. Paro won't listen to me. They won't listen to me. I don't want it. Get somebody better. He argues again and again and again and again. And Hashem says, sorry, you're the guy. You're the person that has to do this. So, you don't speak well, so Aaron will be your speaker, Aaron will be your intermediary, etc. So Moshe didn't want this job. Moshe said, I can't do it. And Hashem said, don't worry about it. I'm going to give you the power to do what you need to do. So Moshe goes to Paro and says, Hashem says, send forth these people. And Paro says, who is this God? Me Hashem. Okay, Paro's like confused, although it's a fake confusion. Me Hashem, Asher Eshma B'Kola. Who is this God you're talking about? I have my list here of all of these different gods. I don't even see him on the list here. And what Paro says is, your people have too much time on their hands. That is why they are agitating for freedom. Because when they have time on their hands, you got to keep your mind occupied. So I'm going to make things worse. You're going to have to get your own straw, go into the fields, gather the straw, and then make your bricks with the straw, and the quotas of the bricks are not going to be diminished. In other words, this apparently, we don't really know exactly how it played out, but apparently from the Chumash's description, this added to the rate of their work at a very, very high level. This made life even much, much more difficult than it was. And this was at the pain of being beaten if the quotas were not met. So, Moshe Rabbeinu walks by, the one who was supposed to be the great Redeemer, and people are looking at him and staring at him and saying, who needed you? And Moshe says to Hashem, Lama Hare Isa, why did you make it worse? I knew this wouldn't work, he says, but at least let me fail at the job, but why does it have to be worse? And from the time that I came to Paro, all that happened was the suffering got worse and worse and worse. That's what the Parsha ends. So, beginning of the Parsha, Hashem says, how dare you not have faith in me? I appeared to the Avos, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and I made many promises to them that I did not fulfill in their lifetime. And they did not question, and they did not doubt. And you doubt right away. And you will see. And then Hashem does give them a promise of redemption. Say to Bnei Yisrael, I am the God of mercy. And then we have 4 Lashonos of redemption. V'otzeisi, I will take them out. V'itzalti, I will save them. V'ga'alti, I will redeem them. V'lakachti etzchem lilem, I will take them unto me for a nation. And then there's a 5th Lashon, and I will bring them, Heveiti etzchem, I will bring them El Haaretz. Now, we all know that Seder night, Leil Seder, there is a mitzvah midrabanan, it's not min Torah, to drink 4 cups of wine, or grape juice, at various points in the Seder. Now, it's interesting, everybody knows the reason, but I just want to point out that the Talmud Bavli does not give any reason for it at all. In other words, the Talmud Bavli assumes there's a mitzvah of Dalit Kosos. It gives no reason at all. The famous reason that everybody knows is actually from the Talmud Yerushalmi. Rashi brings in Arvi Psachim from the Talmud Yerushalmi that the 4 cups of wine correspond to the 4 Lashonot of Geula, V'hotzeisi, V'hitzalti, V'ga'alti, V'lokachti, and to celebrate that we have 4 kosot of wine. What about the 5th Lashon of V'hevesi? So here the Meforshim explain. Now there is one Mandi Amar in the Gemara, Rabbi Tarfon, who actually says Kos Chamishi Keneged V'hevesi. There is such an opinion, and in fact there are Gaonim who either paskin like that, or say it's a good thing to do. And there are some Hasidim that actually have a kos chamishi, but we paskin not that way because we basically say that the kos chamishi is a reference to the ultimate return to Eretz Yisrael, b'mot Mashiach. That even now, even though Baruch Hashem we're in Eretz Yisrael, but klal kibbutz galiyot has not occurred bishlei muto, and ve'veti eschem el haaretz is kibbutz galiyot bishlei muto. That should be limot Mashiach. This is the meaning of kos shel aliyot, right? Ashkenazim, Sephardim don't have it unless they borrowed from Ashkenazim, which many did on this custom. But Ashkenazim have this fifth cup that they don't drink. That is called Eliyahu's cup. And why is it Eliyahu's cup? Because Eliyahu Hanavi is the one that's going to announce the coming of Mashiach. So essentially what we're saying is, this is the extra cup we're going to drink when Eliyahu Hanavi announces Mashiach. Right now we don't drink it yet, because he hasn't come yet. But we're setting it aside. Just like the Chavis Chaim used to have a special garment that he would set aside when Mashiach comes. He'll have a special garment. This cup we set aside for Mashiach. That's the kos of Eliyahu Hanavi and the like. So now, so all of us know this basic idea that the 4 cups of wine are keneged the arba lishonot of Geula. But what is the meaning? Why are there 4 lishonot of Geula? Yetziat Mitzrayim. There was Yetziat Mitzrayim. What is the 4 lishonot of Geula? So let me share with you 2 different midrashim. Medrash number 1 says that the 4 lishonot of Geula represent the idea that Hashem redeemed us from 4 evil decrees of Paro. Now, these are not all at the same time, but in the course of our Abdut in Mitzrayim, there were 4 gezerot ra'ot of Paro from which we were extricated. What are the 4 gezerot? Well, the first was the longest one. That's Abdut, the gezerah of being a slave. The second gezerah was his initial decree that the miyaldot, the midwives, Shifra and Pua, should strangle or kill every newborn Jewish male. And they didn't do that, but there was a gezerah that were supposed to do that. So Hashem saved us from that. The third gezerah was the chayolim, that his soldiers should come in and throw the boys into the river. We were saved from that. And the last gezerah was kash, the last gezerah of gathering the straw. And these are 4 gezerot ra'ot of Paro, and the 4 lashonot of Geula are keneged the 4 gezerot of Paro. That is Medrash number 1. Medrash number 2 says that the 4 lashonot of Geula are not referring to Mitzrayim at all. They are referring to the 4 exiles that will be after Mitzrayim. That Kishem, that Hashem saved us from Mitzrayim, he will save us, or he has saved us in some cases, from the other Galuyot. What are the 4 Galuyot? There is the Galut of Bavel that destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash. There is the Galut of Persia, where Haman wanted to wipe us out. There is the Galut of Yavan, Antiochos, and Chanukah. And then there's the Galut of Edom, which we are still in. This is the Galut of Bnei Esav, the Romans, who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. And we are still in Galut Edom even today, even though there are no Romans, but their Galut is still here. Again, many have added a 5th Galut, the Galut of Yishmael, and that deserves a talk of its own. I think you're going to have a talk of its own on that inyan. But Chazal do not speak of 5 Galuyot. Chazal speak of 4 Galuyot, and they regard Yishmael as a certain intensification that is added on and superimposed on the Galut of Edom. So it turns out we have 2 different midrashim. Are the 4 kosot, 4 lashonot of Geula rather, are they keneged the 4 gezerot of Paro, or are they keneged the 4 galuyot, some of which we've already been redeemed from, and Galut Edom we hope to be redeemed from? So these are 2 different midrashim, but there's a very intriguing machshava from the Chidushei Harim. The Chidushei Harim is the first Gerer Rebbe. And he says the 2 midrashim are actually connected. Because this is what he said. Ideally, we should have been in Mitzrayim for 400 years. That was the period of time that Hashem had told Abraham. Now, we were only in Mitzrayim 210 years. We were not there 400 years. Hashem took us out 190 years early. Why did he take us out early? Because, as it were, we were at the 49th level of impurity, and had we stayed even one more minute, whatever that means, we would have been irredeemable. The Arizal says, that's the meaning of the statement, we didn't have time to let our dough rise. It had to be baked as matzah. Now, how long does it take for dough to rise and become chametz? It only takes 18 minutes. But the Ari says, if we would have stayed 18 minutes more in Mitzrayim, that would have been the end. I mean, we don't even understand what that means, but that's how close we were. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu truncated the 400 years to only 210. But the Chiddushei HaRim says the following. I'm going to use a modern example. He doesn't use this example. Imagine a person has cancer, and the cancer has to be aggressively treated with chemotherapy. But the chemotherapy could kill the patient. So as a result, the chemotherapy has to be discontinued because it will kill the patient. But when the chemotherapy is discontinued, there is still cancer within the patient that might grow and grow and grow and require radical treatment later. But there was no choice because at that time, the patient would have died. The Chiddushei HaRim says the same type of dynamic applies to spiritual imperfection. There were spiritual imperfections in our character that needed 400 years of galus. But that 400 years of galus wasn't allowed to play its course because we would have died, we would have disappeared. So we left Mitzrayim with all of these flaws within us. And because we couldn't last 190 years, we need thousands and thousands and thousands of years of galus to get rid, because the cancer grew and expanded. Therefore, the Chiddushei HaRim says, if we would have completed the 4 decrees of Paro over the 400 years, we wouldn't have needed the 4 galuyot. We would have gone to Eretz Yisrael right away. But Nebuch, because those gezerot were not fulfilled to their fullest extent, that is why we needed the 4 galuyot. It's a very disheartening thought. We've been in galuyot for more, 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years. And if we would have lasted 192 at the very beginning, that would have been it, right? There would be no need for that at that point. So, 190 years, not 100. Yeah. Now, here is the thing. Therefore, so what the Chiddushei HaRim wants to do, again, this deserves more time than we have, is he wants to say each gezerah of Paro, when it was cut short, corresponds to a particular galut. The first gezerah turned into galut Bavel. The second gezerah turned into galut Paras. The third gezerah, I'll explain how, turned into galut Yavan. And the fourth gezerah turned into galut Edom. Now, how is that so? So some of these are easy to understand. Some of them are a bit more murky. The first gezerah of Paro was simply slavery. Slavery is loss of freedom, loss of sovereignty. Well, that's Galut Bavel, because Galut Bavel was the nation that conquered Eretz Yisrael and destroyed our sovereignty. See, after that, the other Galuyot just conquered, right? Persia just conquered Bavel, Yavan conquered Persia, and Rome conquered Yavan. Even though we considered Malchut Chashmonai, we consider it to be a continuation of Yavan. So the one that really destroyed the Malchut B'Yisrael was Bavel. Right? Bavel destroyed the Malchut. So therefore, the Avdut of Paro, which is the loss of freedom, the loss of sovereignty, the loss of autonomy, that became Galut Bavel. Okay. Second Gezerah was an attempted genocide. The Miyaldot were ordered to strangle, to kill Jewish babies. Baruch Hashem, Shifra and Pur refused to do it, so that didn't happen. But we'll call the second Gezerah the the attempted genocide of the Jewish nation. Well, that turned into Golut Paras, because what did Paras want to do? What did Persia want to do? The Gezerah of Haman. And therefore, because that Gezerah of genocide was not carried out, we became subject to Paras later. Okay.
Was it not carried out at all? There were no babies thrown into the Nile?
No, that's the third one. The second one is the Mialdot. The third one, the Mialdot. The Mialdot didn't do anything. Now, we then come to the third. Now, this already, the thinking is much more symbolic. It's less explicit. The third is also genocide, except instead of the Mialdot, the soldiers, Paro soldiers, were supposed to throw male children into the Nile. And here, some of the children were thrown into the Nile. There were casualties. Now, this corresponds to Yavan. Now, why is that so, Yavan? Right? Because Yavan was not a genocide thing. So here the Chiddushei HaRim resorts to symbolic thinking, metaphorical thinking. We know that water, Mayim, represents Torah, but in a more general sense, Mayim represents Chachma, wisdom. It gives life, it cleanses you, etc. Now, water is absolutely necessary for life. But if you stick your face in the water for too long, that very thing that gives you life can actually destroy you and kill you. You will suffocate with the very thing that's the most important substance other than oxygen. Water is the most important substance for life, and yet that very substance can kill you if taken in the wrong way. Yavan represents a culture of great, great wisdom. The wisdom of philosophy, mathematics, science, art, literature. Even the beauty of the human body and the human form. Yavan represents Chachma, and Hellenism, in a positive way, was an attempt to expose the Jewish people to all of this Chachma. But when the Chachma replaces observance of God's law, it then becomes the water that suffocates instead of purifying. So metaphorically, the gezerah of throwing the babies in the water became the galut of the water of Chachma becoming suffocating and killing instead of enriching your life in Avodas Hashem. And that is why the destructive water became the gezerah of Yavan. But we then come to the fourth. And this may be the most important of all, because after all, the fourth galut is by far the longest galut. Galut Edom. No other galut is even 1/10 of this amount of time. And yet, the fourth gezerah doesn't seem to be such a big deal. The gezerah of Teven, gathering straw. It made life harder, but why would that be connected to Galut Edom? The answer is that the Torah itself describes the gathering of straw as Vayafetz ha'am. The people had to spread out. It is a pizor, a hafatzah. And hafatzah, or pizor, is a characteristic of Galut Edom in a number of discrete ways. First of all, this Galut by far is the largest geographical dispersion of the Jewish people. Think about the Galut Bavel. So the Jews were in Babylon. They were in Babylonia. They all were in one country. But the notion that there are Jews everywhere in the world, that's really from the Galut Edom, because the Roman Empire ruled over most of the world, and we were scattered all over the place. There are Jews even in Antarctica. I know this because I saw an advertisement for Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, who's a chaver of mine in there, saw a very, very popular lecture in Magid Shir, that the Rabbi Friend has listeners on every continent, even Antarctica. Some guy in the army is listening to Shiurei Torah. Now, in a way, the Gemara tells us this has a positive idea, that God wanted there would be Jews everywhere in the world so that they would attract Gerim. Now, it's interesting. On one hand, we don't proselytize. but Hashem wants us to be around so that the souls that are attuned to Torah will have something to be connected to. So geographically we're dispersed. But it's much more than geography. The characteristic of Galut Edom is sinat chinam, polarization, dissension, disunity. Being scattered is not just a phenomenon of how far away you are, but it's how far you are to emotionally to connect to other Jews. That this is a galut in which polarization and sinat chinam is so dominant. And this is on so many levels. It's between Jew and Jew, whether it's religious, secular, or religious, Hasidic, Misnagdic, different types of Hasidim, different types of Misnagdic. There comes a point in which the differences are so subtle that one can't even articulate what the basis of the sinat chinam is, but it exists. The sinat chinam also exists on family levels. Husband and wife, lack of shalom bayis, parents and children. All of this is pizor, hafatzah, scattering. But then there's another aspect of scattering that's even more interesting. It's not just geographical dispersion, and it's not just sinat chinam, but the individual is scattered within himself because he is bombarded with so many inputs, so many choices, so many sources of information that there's no way to prioritize, there's no way to get a sense of where I should be going in life. Because every time I want to make a move in one direction, I'm confronted with other alternatives. I remember seeing an advertisement years ago for a delicatessen in Maryland, in which they said, we offer 300 types of mustard. So I was thinking to myself, let's imagine my wife would ask me, Erev Shabbos, go to the store and pick me up some mustard. And I'd walk into a store, and I would see 300 types of mustard. I might spend Shabbos in the store. Like, what do you do, right? Life is easier in Romania, just one choice, whatever it is, for everything, if it's even available. What do they say? They tell a story about a woman who came in one of these former communist countries, and she asked for hamburger, steak, roast beef. They didn't have anything. So she left. So one butcher says to the other, that woman is a real nudge. So the other guy said, yeah, but what a memory. Okay. She remembered. Okay. So that's what happened. But the point is, being overwhelmed with choice. Choice is a wonderful thing. But choice can also be overwhelming and paralyzing sometimes. And as a result, even if you want to get a Dvar Torah and the Parsha and the internet, right? You ever try getting a Dvar Torah? You're going to get, I don't know what you're going to get, 10,000 pages of stuff. Now, good, and it may be 8,000 is worthless, but so what? How are you going to know? So the notion of pizor hafatzah is geographic, it's interpersonal, and it also reflects the confusion within us in which we're unable to focus and get a sense of what is genuine. And finally, it represents the split between the head and the heart. It is said in the name of, some say it in the name of Nachman of Breslov, and some say it B'Shem Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. So it's interesting, both Hasidim and Misnagdim claim the statement that the biggest distance in the world is the distance between the head and the heart. The head, the mind, we know what we should do and how we should live, but our emotions and our feelings are just not there. That's also pizor, scattering within yourself. Your mind knows, but your feelings are not there. Where's the enthusiasm, the geschmack, the passion, the excitement? So this is the Chedushei Rim's idea that the fourth galut corresponds in many ways to the fourth gezerah of Paro. Okay, so the first gezerah, loss of freedom, is galut Bavel. The second Gezerah, attempted genocide by the Yaldot, corresponds to Persia. The third Gezerah, drowning in the water, corresponds to being overwhelmed with the Chachma of Yavan, that potentially is life-giving, but can also destroy. And the fourth Gezerah, of scattering and looking for straw, corresponds to the Hafatzah and the Pizor, the scatteredness of Golut Edom in so many ways, in terms of geography, in terms of Sinat Chinam, in terms of being overwhelmed and bombarded with options, and in terms of emotional distance from what we know is right, and we're not feeling what our minds have embraced. And the tragedy is, had we been able to be mashlim, the 4 gezerot of Paro, within the 400 years, there would not have been a need for all of these tikkunim that have already been almost 2,000 years. So Bezras Hashem, we hope we are coming to the end of the Galot, and we should be zochet to be at Mashiach Tzidkenu. And as the Navi Micha says, he's not our Haftorah this week, Ki mei tzeitcha me'eretz Mitzrayim arenu niflaot. Hashem will show us the wonders equivalent, if not greater, than the days, the wonders that he showed us when he took us out of Mitzrayim. And that's also in the Svardik Kedusha for Musaf. Hein galti etchem acharit kireshit. That I will redeem you at the end of days as I did in the beginning of days. And that is through the miracles of the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shekhinah. Have a good week.
Amen.